The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal 3 of O'Hare International Airport as Dr. Mai stepped through the automatic doors, rolling her carry-on behind her. Like clockwork, she arrived 3 hours before her 9 a.m. flight, a habit ingrained from years of traveling for medical conferences. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries wafted through the air as sleepy travelers shuffled through security checkpoints. As one of the country's leading neurosurgeons, she had made the Chicago to San Francisco route her second home. Each trip represented another opportunity to share her research, teach new surgical techniques, or collaborate with colleagues. Today's conference would focus on breakthrough treatments for pediatric brain tumors, her life's work for the past decade. The pre-flight routine was almost meditative. Check-in, security, a quick stop at her favorite coffee shop where the barista knew her usual order, green tea, no sugar, and finally, the peaceful walk to Gate B-17. Fellow passengers rushed past, some sprinting to make their flights, others leisurely browsing duty-free shops. She caught fragments of conversations, business deals, family reunions, vacation plans, each person carrying their own story through the terminal. At the gate, she pulled out her laptop to review her presentation one last time. The PowerPoint slides showed complex brain scans and surgical procedures, representing countless hours of research and dedication. A small girl in a bright yellow dress walked past, waving at her. Dr. May smiled and waved back, remembering why she chose pediatric neurosurgery in the first place. The boarding call came right on schedule. First class, Group 1. She gathered her belongings, straightened her navy blazer, and joined the line. Her frequent flyer status had earned her these comfortable seats, a small luxury that made the constant travel more bearable. As she walked down the jet bridge, she exchanged a friendly nod with the flight attendant who had served on several of her previous flights. Settling into seat 2A, she went through her pre-flight ritual. Jacket folded neatly in the overhead bin, laptop stowed, phone set to airplane mode. The leather seat was familiar and comfortable, like an old friend. Through the window, she watched the ground crew load luggage and prepare the aircraft. A light drizzle had started, creating tiny rivers on the window pane. Other passengers filed past. A young couple holding hands, an elderly man helping his wife with her bag, a businessman deeply engrossed in his phone conversation. The usual symphony of overhead bins, closing, and seats adjusting filled the cabin. Dr. Mai pulled out the latest medical journal from her bag, flipping to an article about innovative brain mapping techniques. The cabin crew began the preparations, checking seatbelts, and offering pre-flight drinks. She accepted a glass of water, her mind already drifting to the conference ahead. She had spent months preparing her presentation on a revolutionary surgical approach that could reduce recovery time for young patients by nearly 40%. The thought of sharing this breakthrough with colleagues made her smile. Each successful surgery meant another child getting back to their normal life faster. As the final passengers boarded, she noticed the sky clearing outside her window. Sunlight broke through the clouds, promising better weather ahead. The familiar hum of the aircraft systems starting up filled the cabin, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with weather and flight time updates. Everything was proceeding exactly as it had on dozens of flights before. Little did she know that this routine Monday morning flight, one of countless others she had taken over her career, was about to become anything but ordinary. In the next 30 minutes, this peaceful cabin would transform into the backdrop for an incident that would challenge not just her, but every person on board to confront their own beliefs and prejudices. The calm before departure was broken by the sound of rushed footsteps coming down the aisle. A well-dressed older couple hurried aboard, their faces flushed from what appeared to be a sprint through the terminal. The flight attendant checked their boarding passes with a practiced smile, directing them to their first-class seats across from Dr. May. The woman, wearing an expensive pearl necklace that caught the cabin lights, took her seat first, while her husband struggled with their carry-on bags. Dr. May glanced up briefly from her medical journal, offering a polite smile. the kind of acknowledgement frequent travelers often exchange. But something in the husband's expression made her pause. His eyes had narrowed, and his mouth turned down at the corners as he surveyed the first-class cabin. He remained standing, despite the flight attendant's gentle reminder about the approaching departure time. "There must be some mistake," he announced, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the plane. Several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines. The flight attendant, a professional with over 15 years of experience named Miss Thompson, approached with a questioning look. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, maintaining her composed demeanor. The man gestured toward Dr. Mai without directly looking at her. "This section is first class," he stated, as if this explained everything. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering something, but he shrugged her off. Dr. Mai felt her chest tighten, a familiar sensation she hadn't experienced since her residency days. She'd dealt with similar situations before. At medical conferences, in hospital corridors, even at upscale restaurants. But somehow, being confronted in this enclosed space, surrounded by strangers, made it feel different. Miss Thompson's smile remained steady, though her eyes showed concern. "Yes, sir, this is indeed first class. All passengers here have valid first-class tickets." She kept her voice low, trying to maintain privacy in the crowded cabin. But the man wasn't interested in discretion. "Could you check her ticket again?" he insisted, finally looking directly at Dr. Mai. "I find it hard to believe." He left the sentence hanging, but his implication hung heavy in the air. A young businessman 2 rows back removed his headphones, frowning as he observed the situation. Dr. Mai took a deep breath, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of her journal. Inside were her latest research papers, her conference presentations, evidence of her decades of hard work. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter to the man standing in the aisle. The cabin had grown unusually quiet. Even the chatter from economy class seemed to have dimmed. A teenager in row 4 had his phone raised, its camera lens capturing the unfolding scene. His mother noticed and whispered something to him, but he didn't lower the device. "Sir," Miss Thompson began again, her tone firmer now, "I can assure you that every passenger in first class has the appropriate ticket. Now, if you could please take your seat, we're about to begin our departure procedures." But the man wasn't finished. He pulled out his reading glasses and made a show of examining his own boarding pass. "I paid a premium for these seats," he announced to no one in particular. "I think we have the right to ensure everything is in order." His wife was now staring straight ahead, her cheeks flushed with what might have been embarrassment. Dr. Mai felt dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few deliberately looking away. She thought about all the times she'd stayed silent, all the times she'd let moments like this pass to avoid conflict. The weight of those memories pressed against her chest as she slowly closed her journal. The cabin pressure seemed to shift, not from the aircraft systems, but from the tension building in that small first-class section. What happened next would transform this routine flight into something none of the passengers would ever forget. A moment that would make headlines and spark conversations across the country about prejudice, privilege, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The tension in the first-class cabin thickened as Miss Thompson returned with her tablet, though everyone knew this additional verification was unnecessary. Dr. Mai sat quietly, her medical journal now closed on her lap, watching as the flight attendant pulled up her booking information. More phones had appeared in surrounding rows, their cameras capturing what was quickly becoming a viral moment. "As I confirmed before," Miss Thompson stated clearly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers, "Dr. Mai is correctly seated in 2A. She's one of our frequent flyers with platinum status." She turned the tablet slightly, showing the man the booking details, though she had no obligation to do so. The man adjusted his glasses, squinting at the screen. "That could be anyone's account," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "I've heard about people using stolen credentials." How can we be sure? A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. An older businessman in row 3 closed his laptop with a sharp click, his attention now fully focused on the scene unfolding before him. A flight attendant from economy class had appeared at the curtain divider, sensing the growing tension. Dr. Mai felt a familiar warmth creeping up her neck, not from embarrassment, but from a steady, building resolve. She'd spent 15 years earning her medical degree, completing her residency, and building her reputation as one of the country's leading pediatric neurosurgeons. Each surgery, each saved life, each grateful family had added another layer to her professional armor. Now, that armor was being tested in an entirely different way. "Would you like to see my medical license?" Her voice was clear and steady, carrying an authority earned in countless operating rooms. "Or perhaps my hospital ID. My invitation to speak at tomorrow's neurosurgery conference." She reached for her bag, her movements deliberate and calm. The man's wife finally broke her embarrassed silence. "Henry, please," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve again. "You're making a scene." But her husband seemed unable, or unwilling, to back down. "I just think," he began, his voice rising defensively, "that in these times we need to be careful about." "About what, sir?" A new voice joined the conversation. An elderly woman 2 rows back had stood up, her silver hair neatly styled, her expression stern. "I've been watching this whole interaction, and I'd very much like to hear you finish that sentence." The cabin had grown so quiet that the hum of the aircraft engines seemed unusually loud. The teenager with the phone was still recording, but now he had been joined by others. Even a flight attendant from business class had appeared, drawn by the unusual silence in first class. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a short delay in departure. Whether this was related to the unfolding situation or just standard airport procedures, no one could tell. But the timing added another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Dr. Mai opened her bag slowly, pulling out her hospital ID and conference materials. The laminated badge caught the overhead light, its holographic security features glinting. Her name and credentials were clearly visible, along with her photograph and the logo of one of the nation's most prestigious hospitals. "I don't need to show you these," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. "But I will. Not because you have any right to demand them, but because this moment is bigger than just you and me." She placed the documents on her tray table, visible to anyone who cared to look. The flight crew had gathered for a quick conference near the cockpit. The lead flight attendant was speaking quietly into her phone, likely communicating with ground staff. The situation had escalated beyond a simple seating dispute, becoming something that would require careful handling. A moment that would force everyone on board to confront their own biases and assumptions. The air in the cabin felt electric, charged with tension and anticipation. What happened next would not only define the rest of the flight, but would become a teachable moment about dignity, prejudice, and the power of standing up for oneself with grace under pressure. Dr. Mai slowly rose from her seat, smoothing her blazer with steady hands. The motion caught everyone's attention: passengers, flight crew, and even the still protesting man. She stood at her full height, 5 feet 4 inches of quiet determination, and took a deep breath that seemed to draw all the cabin's tension into her lungs. "I've been quiet long enough," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin. "Not just today, but for years." She glanced around, making eye contact with several passengers who had been watching the scene unfold. "I was born in this country. I went to school here. I've saved lives here, children's lives." A baby started fussing in business class, and its mother quickly soothed it. The sound somehow made the moment more real, more human. Dr. Mai continued, her voice growing stronger, but never harsh. "Yesterday, I spent 12 hours in surgery, helping a 6-year-old boy regain the chance to walk again. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to present research that could help hundreds more children." She paused, letting her words sink in. But right now, in this moment, none of that matters to you, does it, sir? The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado diminishing under her steady gaze. His wife had her face partially covered with her hands, but she was watching through her fingers, unable to look away. You took one look at me and decided you knew everything you needed to know. Dr. Mee's voice remained measured, educational, rather than accusatory. You didn't see a doctor, or a researcher, or even just another tired traveler. You saw what you expected to see, and that's the problem we need to talk about. The teenage boy who had been recording lowered his phone slightly, caught up in the moment. An older flight attendant wiped quickly at her eyes. The businessman who had closed his laptop earlier nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. This isn't just about a seat on a plane, Dr. Mai continued, gesturing to the first-class cabin around her. It's about the assumptions we carry, the judgments we make, and the opportunities we deny others when we let those assumptions guide us. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small photo. This is Tommy, the boy I operated on yesterday. His parents didn't care what their surgeon looked like. They only cared that I could help their son. She held up the photo, a smiling child giving a thumbs up from a hospital bed. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A young professional in a business suit slowly removed his headphones, fully engaging with the moment. The cabin crew stood respectfully still, recognizing the importance of what was unfolding. I've earned my place here, Dr. Mai stated firmly, just as I've earned my place in the operating room, in the research lab, and in every other space where people like you might question my belonging. She gestured to her credentials, still lying on the tray table. These are just paper. The real proof of who I am and what I can do is in the lives I've touched, the families I've helped, and the work I continue to do. The man who had started this confrontation now stared at his own hands, his face red with what might have been shame or embarrassment. His wife had finally removed her hands from her face, and tears were visible on her cheeks. So yes, I'm sitting in first class, Dr. Mai concluded, her voice softening, but losing none of its power. And I'll be here again next week, and the week after that, traveling to help more children, to teach more doctors, to do the work I was meant to do. The question isn't whether I belong here. The question is, when will we stop having to prove we belong in spaces we've already earned? The silence that followed her words was different from the tense quiet before. It was a silence full of reflection, of minds processing and perhaps changing. In that moment, the first-class cabin of Flight AA-1203 had become more than just a space for privileged travel. It had become a classroom for human dignity and understanding. The silence that followed Dr. Mee's words lasted only a few heartbeats before it was broken by the sound of hands coming together. The applause started softly. A gentle clap from the elderly woman in row 4, quickly joined by others until it filled the cabin with unexpected warmth. But what happened next transformed this moment into something even more remarkable. A middle-aged man in a teacher's worn blazer stood up from his seat near the window. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. I've been teaching high school for 30 years, he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Every day, I see bright young minds doubting themselves because of other people's expectations. He looked directly at Dr. Mai. What you just did, that's the lesson I've been trying to teach my students all along. Before the impact of his words could fully settle, a young woman in business attire rose from her seat in row 5. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. 2 weeks ago, I was told I was too young to be a project manager, she shared. I've been sitting here wondering if I should speak up, just like I wonder every day at work. But watching you stand up for yourself just now, she paused, gathering strength. Well, maybe it's time we all started speaking up. The cabin had transformed. What began as a confrontation had become a moment of shared experiences and understanding. A gentleman with salt and pepper hair near the front spoke next, his accent revealing hints of his Middle Eastern heritage. I built my company from nothing, he said quietly. 20 years in this country, and still, sometimes when I board a plane. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The knowing nods around the cabin showed that many understood exactly what he meant. The flight attendants stood respectfully at their stations, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Even passengers in business class had turned in their seats, straining to hear the spontaneous outpouring of stories. An older woman with arthritic hands clutched her handbag as she spoke next. I remember when they wouldn't let women open bank accounts without their husband's permission, she said. Every time someone stands up like you just did, dear, it makes it a little easier for those who come after. The teenager who had been recording everything slowly lowered his phone completely. My sister wants to be a doctor, he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. She's going to see this video. She needs to see this. The atmosphere in a cabin had shifted completely. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had blossomed into an unexpected moment of community. People who had been strangers minutes ago were now exchanging understanding looks and supportive nods. A young mother bouncing a baby in row 3 spoke up next. I bring my daughter to board meetings, she said. People raised their eyebrows, but she needs to see her mom leading. Just like these kids need to see doctors who look like them. She smiled at Dr. May. Thank you for showing her what courage looks like. Even the flight crew seemed moved. The lead flight attendant, who had seen countless dramas unfold on countless flights, wiped a tear from her cheek. In 15 years of flying, she said, I've never seen anything quite like this. The man who had initially questioned Dr. Mee's presence sat in his seat, his head bowed. His wife had reached across to hold his hand, and there was something like recognition dawning in his eyes. The cabin around them had become more than just a space for travel. It had transformed into a place of understanding, of shared stories, of barriers being gently but firmly dismantled. Through it all, Dr. Mai stood quietly, her presence a catalyst for this extraordinary moment. She watched as more passengers found their voices, each story building on the last, creating something powerful and unexpected at 30,000 feet. This wasn't just about one person standing up anymore. It had become about an entire community rising together, sharing their truths, and showing what change really looks like. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his presence commanding immediate attention. His silver-streaked hair and calm demeanor spoke of decades of experience, but even he seemed moved by what he had just witnessed through the cabin's security cameras. He conferred briefly with the lead flight attendant, their hushed conversation barely audible over the aircraft's gentle hum. Meanwhile, the ground crew could be seen through the windows, preparing for departure. The delay counter on the gate display outside showed 15 minutes, though time seemed to have taken on a different quality inside the aircraft. The shared stories had created a unique atmosphere, something between a family gathering and a peaceful protest. The captain cleared his throat, addressing the cabin with the same steady voice he used for weather announcements, though this was anything but routine. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I've been flying for 27 years, and I believe what we've witnessed today deserves special attention. He glanced at his crew, then continued. We have 2 options before us. Our company policy is clear about discriminatory behavior, and we have the authority to remove passengers who make others feel unsafe or unwelcome. He paused, letting that sink in. However, today, I'd like to try something different. The man who had questioned Dr. Mee's presence shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife squeezed his hand tighter, her tissues damp with tears of embarrassment. The captain turned to address them directly, his tone professional but gentle. Sir, madam, we're offering you a choice, he said. You can either move to our economy section, where we have 2 seats available, or you can stay here in first class. But only if you're willing to have an honest conversation about what happened today. The cabin held its breath. The teenager's phone was recording again, capturing this unexpected moment of airline diplomacy. The captain continued, This isn't about punishment. It's about understanding. Dr. Mai has shown incredible grace under pressure, and her fellow passengers have shared powerful stories. We have an opportunity here to turn this incident into something meaningful. The lead flight attendant stepped forward with her tablet. We've already contacted our ground staff. If you choose to move to economy, we'll process a partial refund for the fare difference. If you stay, we ask that you spend this flight reflecting on and discussing what we've all witnessed today. The man looked up, his face flushed with a mix of emotions. His wife whispered something in his ear, and he nodded slowly. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. I would like to stay, and apologize, and listen. The collective release of tension was almost audible. The captain nodded approvingly. Very well. Miss Thompson will be monitoring this section of the cabin closely. Any further inappropriate comments will result in immediate removal upon landing. He turned to address the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our departure procedures. Today's flight may have started with an unfortunate incident, but you've all helped transform it into an example of how we should handle these situations. Thank you for your patience and understanding. As the captain returned to the cockpit, the flight attendants began their final preparations. The man turned tentatively toward Dr. Mai. Doctor, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Would you be willing to tell me about the children you help? Dr. Mai considered for a moment, then nodded. I think we can have that conversation, she replied. The elderly woman who had first spoken up smiled approvingly, settling back into her seat to witness what might be another small step toward understanding. Outside, the late morning sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light through the cabin windows. The engines began their startup sequence, their steady rumble a backdrop to the murmured conversations now taking place throughout first class. What had started as a confrontation was ending as a conversation, proof that even at 30,000 feet, people could find common ground when given the chance. The sun was setting over San Francisco Bay as Flight AA 1203 touched down, its wheels meeting the runway with a gentle thud. But this wasn't just another arrival. The events that had unfolded during the flight were already spreading across social media, carried by hundreds of shares and thousands of comments. The teenager's video had gone viral before they even landed. His simple caption, "What I saw on my flight today changed how I think about everything," had struck a chord with viewers worldwide. By the time passengers were collecting their bags, the clip had already been viewed over 1 million times. Dr. Mai walked through the terminal alongside the elderly woman who had first spoken up in her defense. They exchanged contact information, the older woman insisting that her granddaughter, an aspiring medical student, needed to hear Dr. Mai's story firsthand. The young mother with her baby stopped to take a photo with them, saying her daughter would someday understand the importance of this day. But the most remarkable transformation was visible in the man who had caused the initial confrontation. He walked quietly beside his wife, occasionally glancing at the business card Dr. Mai had given him. Not just her contact information, but an invitation to visit her hospital's pediatric ward. "See for yourself what we do," she had told him. "Meet the families whose lives we change." The story continued to grow. Morning news shows picked up the teenager's video, but they found something more compelling than just another viral moment. They discovered a story about change, real, human change that happened not through confrontation, but through conversation. A week later, Dr. Mai stood before a packed auditorium at the medical conference. Before beginning her presentation on pediatric neurosurgery, she shared what had happened on the flight. The audience listened in complete silence as she described not just the incident, but the extraordinary response from her fellow passengers. In that moment, she told them, everyone on that plane had a choice. They could stay silent, or they could stand up. They chose to stand up, not with anger, but with their own stories, their own truths. The airline's response became a case study in corporate responsibility. Instead of simply removing the passenger or issuing a generic statement, they had created an opportunity for learning. Their training programs were updated to include this incident as an example of how to handle discrimination with firmness and compassion. The ripple effects continued. The teacher who had spoken up wrote about the experience in his blog, reaching educators across the country. The young project manager started a mentorship program at her company, helping other young professionals find their voice. The teenager's sister, inspired by the video, doubled down on her pre-med studies. 3 months later, Dr. Mai received a letter. It was from the man on the plane. He wrote about how that flight had changed him, how he had visited the pediatric ward as promised, and how watching her work had opened his eyes. "I saw you save a child's life," he wrote, "and I realized how blind I had been to see anything but your appearance." A year passed. The video became part of diversity training programs in companies and schools. Dr. Mai was invited to speak about her experience, though she often focused more on the response of her fellow passengers than on the initial confrontation. "Change happens," she would say, "when we give people the chance to be their better selves." The most lasting impact, though, wasn't in the viral moments or policy changes. It was in the quiet transformations. The conversations started, the assumptions challenged, the minds opened. On other flights, in other places, people who had seen the video began to speak up, to share their stories, to stand for what was right. The teenage videographer, now in college, created a documentary about how a single moment of courage can spark a movement. He interviewed passengers from that flight, each sharing how that day had altered their perspective. But his favorite interview was with Dr. Mai, who told him something he never forgot. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of truth. We just have to be brave enough to speak them.